Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Conspiracy Farm, where we don't start the conspiracies, we just add the water. And now, your hosts of the most state-of-the-art, most informed podcast on the interweb, I present to you Pat Miletich and Jeffrey Wilson. Ladies and gentlemen, are you ready for war?
Yes. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. We are once again locked and loaded for another episode of the Conspiracy Farm. It's me, Jeffrey Wilson, coming to you live and direct from here. I'm sitting in St. Louis, Missouri, always with my co-host, riding shotgun, UFC Hall of Famer Pat Miletich. How are we doing this afternoon, champion?
I'm doing great. Jeffrey, and I will say you've outdone yourself.
Well, you know, this guy, I've told you off air, we've had him on the show before. I'm beyond a huge fan. Even though I did introduce him incorrectly last.
Returning.
What's that?
We've had our best guests returning.
Absolutely. Well, they just can't get enough, and honestly, we can't just get enough of them because their information is so very interesting. This guy here, he is an Oxford professor, an author of a great many books, including some of my favorites. The Giza Death Star, Financial Vipers of Venice, the Babylon Banksters, Nazi International, and the list goes on. You can, obviously, at the end of this interview, you can he will drop his social media. You can find out where he's at. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Joseph Ferrell is with us today. How are you today, sir?
Pretty good. Thanks for having me back. I'm not actually an Oxford professor. I just got my PhD there.
Are you telling me I messed it up again 2 times? Come on. Yeah, that is true. A PhD from Oxford. Boy, oh boy. It always has to be something, doesn't it? But again, I am a huge fan, sir. I mean, again, like I said last time, if I had $1 for every hour I've listened to your videos and it just like went into your research, it is so very fascinating. And the last time we talked, I kind of messed up the order of everything. The last time we talked, we kind of started with pre-World War II Europe and the role the Nazis played and the Americans played in the Nazi war machine, et cetera, et cetera. Sir, what we need right now, and have you seen in the world, we are at each other's throats, divide and conquer is in huge effect on my Facebook timeline, and it's just crazy and throughout the world. I want a little bit of perspective. I want to rewind the clock quite a bit, if you don't mind. And with a lot of your information, I think you can kind of help us do that and realize so much of this is by design, and we oftentimes get caught up in a lot of the minutia of this. As it relates to one of your books, the Babylon Banksters, High Physics, High Finance, and Ancient Religion, and the Alchemy of Deep Physics, High Finance, and Ancient Religion, and also going to kind of coincide that with the Cosmic War. I'm going to toss you a softball here and almost let you go on a rant here for about 40 minutes the way I set this up. Tell us about the Cosmic War, if you will, and how that led to what you describe as a cosmic Versailles Treaty.
Well, I took the thesis of Dr. Tom Van Flandern, who used to be the U.S. Naval Observatory astronomer prior to his death. He died just very recently. He wrote a book called Dark Matter, New Planets, Missing Comets, or something like that. I could never remember the title of that book. But in it, he advanced the hypothesis that was very popular back in the early 19th century when astronomers discovered the first asteroids. And they were actually looking for a planet where the asteroid belt was, because there was an astronomical law that was called the Titius-Bode law, named after 2 German astronomers who formulated this law. And basically the law predicted the harmonics of the orbits of the planets from the sun. And according to the law, it predicted all the planets, except there should have been a planet in the asteroid belt. And so not finding it, and then later finding small asteroids at the beginning of the 19th century, astronomers formulated the hypothesis that the planet that was there had exploded. It had blown up. And Dr. Van Flandern revived that hypothesis in a number of ways, looking at the composition of various asteroids and so on. And he also looked at the orbits of comets and then ran a computer program basing on these orbits and ran them backwards. And he discovered a very interesting phenomenon that many of the comets that we know that come into the solar system appear to have been the debris, the ejecta from that exploded planet, because they all originated in the asteroid belt. The orbits of these comets originated there. And he ran the program and discovered that the planet had to have exploded at one of two possible dates in the ancient past. One date was 65 million years ago, which corresponds rather well with the KT geological boundary layer and the extinction of the dinosaurs. And the other date was approximately 3.2 million years ago. And that date interested me because if you look at ancient lore, if you look at the Mesopotamian texts, if you look at Greek mythology, of course, they have the Gigantomachy, the battle with the giants, which if you do the astrological names, the battle against Kronos, well, Kronos is actually the Greek name for Saturn, the planet Saturn. So there was a great deal of lore about this ancient cosmic war of the gods, and from Mesopotamia, from Greece, from Rome. Pretty much every civilization has some version of this. We tend to know it in the West from the biblical version of, the battle between Michael the archangel and Lucifer.
Okay.
But there's this cosmic war tradition, and I got looking at the texts and discovered that this was basically a kind of if you will, a civil war in the pantheon of the gods, regardless of which tradition you looked at, Mesopotamian, Greek, Roman, what have you. So it looked to me kind of like, if I can draw the analogy, it looked to me kind of like an interplanetary version of World War One, if you want to think of it that way, because of course World War One, you had the ruling houses of Europe basically all battling each other, and they're all related. Kaiser Wilhelm II was the great grandson of Queen Victoria, cousin to Tsar Nicholas II.
I want to move. I want to get to that on how all this kind of moves forward through history. But no, you're absolutely right.
Yeah, it's an analogy to World War One. But what really kind of struck me, you mentioned the idea of what I call the Versailles template for this cosmic war. Because when you look at this ancient war, the text describes something very interesting if you kind of assemble them all together and look at them whole. The first thing that they describe, particularly the Mesopotamian epics, is that after this big cosmic war, they took an inventory of the defeated side's inventory or arsenal. This is found in an epic called the Epic of Ninurta, and I put the whole thing, this whole Babylonian epic, in my book, The Cosmic War. And the reason I did that is very simple, because if you read this thing, it's about as exciting as reading the index to the Sears catalog. It's not an epic, folks. It's just an inventory. But it's a rather unique one because, again, if you draw the World War I analogy, what do the Allied and associated powers do at the end of World War I? Well, they take an inventory of the German war machine, and they cart off some of it. They basically steal the technology and decide to use some of it in other applications. And they forbid the Germans from producing certain types of armaments under the stipulations of the Treaty of Versailles.
Just to stop you real fast, I mean, this is
Sure.
something I found very fascinating. World War I, and I believe you said World War I, the Germans had a certain level of technology and were downing certain amount of French planes using a certain technology, wireless technology or something. Was that World War I that they were first kind of...
That was after World War I in the 1920s. I talked about that in a conference talk I gave in Bastrop, Texas, at the Secret Space Program conference in 2015. They did have something going on in Germany very clearly. And it would have been interesting for the Germans to investigate that kind of technology because they were not prohibited under the Treaty of Versailles terms from investigating those types of technologies. The treaty was very specific on what types of heavy weapons they could and could not produce. So I think there is a case to be argued that yeah, they began to experiment in some of these very exotic things almost as soon as the ink was dry on the treaty. But the other interesting thing that really kind of grabbed me about this comparison between this ancient cosmic war and World War I was that in World War I's case, at the Treaty of Versailles, you had a quarantine zone effectively put around Germany. In the West, there was a demilitarized zone that extended about 30 kilometers on the east bank of the Rhine that was supposed to be completely demilitarized. And then, of course, everything west of the Rhine River was supposed to be completely demilitarized. So there was a quarantine zone around Germany on the west. And the French subsequently, under Clemenceau, began to weave a system of alliances in Eastern Europe to put yet another kind of quarantine zone around Germany in the east, and also to isolate Soviet Russia from any inroads into continental Europe. So there was this quarantine zone around Germany. Well, if you go back and look at the ancient texts, you find in the Book of Enoch, for example, the Slavonic text, you find this idea that the Earth is in a kind of a quarantine zone. And depending on which versions of this quarantine zone you read about, depending on the text that you read, but in Enoch, this boundary zone that humanity is not supposed to step across is at the orbit of the moon. So there's all sorts of very, very interesting parallels. And that quarantine zone really got me thinking, because if you recall, all of our space probes, when we first began launching probes to the moon and then, of course, to the other planets in the solar system, we would put these little placards on our probes. We come in peace for all mankind, things of this sort. And I began to wonder if those placards were not simply an expression of, peaceful intention, a sort of interesting gesture, but if they were not put on there because there were people in the national security establishment that suspected or had figured out from those ancient texts that there was some sort of perhaps cosmic Versailles treaty.
Right. It's addressed to somebody, right? That's a message to someone.
Right, exactly. So, that's the Cosmic War Versailles template in a nutshell. That's the Cliff Notes version.
No, and I appreciate that, because I know we don't. I mean, like I said, you've done hours and many of books and written on this subject. So segue that, and so that quarantine, if you will, was for as you spoke about in your books and in your videos, was for a certain technology, correct? A certain level of weaponry, or what was the quarantine for? To keep whomever from receiving?
Well, I suspect that the quarantine zone, if you're looking at it from the Cosmic War perspective, that it was much like the demilitarized zone around Germany, because what the Allied powers were effectively trying to do was to push the deployment areas of any potential German mobilization in the future back behind the Rhine, so that their jumping off point would be much farther back from where it was at the beginning of World War I. But the other thing that's very interesting here is if you read that Epic of Ninurta, it is almost an exact parallel of what you find happening at the end of World War I, because the victorious side in that ancient interplanetary war basically takes an inventory of the defeated side's arsenal, carts off some of it, and then destroys other bits of it, which again the Allies did after World War I, And then there are some technologies that could not be destroyed, so they hid them. So, and it's kind of interesting because, of course, at the end of World War One, the Germans hid some of their, super advanced designs for artillery pieces and so on and so forth. The Allies tried to get these things, and of course, they never were successful.
Well, I guess that leads me to, so from that, do you have a timeline of when this cosmic war took place in the, Versailles template, etc.?
That's an excellent question. And the way I approached the problem in the cosmic war was to paint in very, very broad strokes for a very simple reason. If you look at the attempts of the alternative research community to make dates for the flood, for example, or for this ancient ice age, or for, in my case, for this cosmic war, you're dealing with so many disparate data sets that a synthesis isn't really immediately possible. So I painted in very broad strokes and basically relied on two things. One was Van Flanderen's late date for the exploded planet, which would have been about 3.2 million years ago. And then the other reason I relied on that date is that if you look at those ancient texts, if you look at the Sumerian Kings List or the Egyptian Kings List and so on and so forth, what you find is a chronology that takes you back, if you take them at their word, takes you back about 250,000 years. So you're still wildly outside of the ballpark of 3.2 million years ago, but it's much easier to reconcile that with new information as it becomes available than it would be to a date of 65 million years ago. And then there's the other problem that you have with the dating of some people of the ruins on Mars. Dr. Mark Carlotto, for example, wants to date some of those ruins to about a little more than 500,000 years ago, which again would be in the ballpark for Van Flanderen's late date. So I paint in very broad strokes, but I kind of leave that chronology question open-ended because we simply don't have enough data.
Well, and quite frankly, as we talk about on this show, and you talk about, and many researchers, they kind of feed us this whole thing that we were just so simple-minded and built the pyramids, and now we're so sophisticated. Now, help me segue that timeline of cosmic war, hidden technology, even whenever it was. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with like Graham Hancock and other people's research, as far as it's very hard to pin down the time frame because the timeline has been so kind of obfuscated and kind of lied about. Talk to me again, if you can, help me segue the notion of the hidden technology and the purpose of that. Because if you go back again to certain research like Graham Hancock's, you're finding places like Göbekli Tepe, megalithic structures, which way predate, where we're supposed to have begun. And then that gets into the whole ice age event. You had miles and miles of ice, which could have ground down any existing civilization. And then he gets into certain certain extinction level events, which melted that ice, raised the temperature, lowered it again. So at the end of the day, though, he's asserting very similar things, that there was an ancient civilization, ancient knowledge, and only a few survived these cataclysmic events to tell the tale. And I'm assuming that information still has to be attributed to some of that cosmic information you're talking about. Talk to me about that and how that emerged in somewhat modern day ancient the Sumerians, the Egyptians, and just basically that priesthood and all of it that kept these secrets of former lives, former technology, if you will. And I'm sorry, and this is conflating a lot, but in how that relates to the models that were then presented to the world through their physics, and how you relate physics with economics, if you will, because that model, I think, limited us in a huge way. And what are your thoughts on that? Was that from keeping us recognizing our huge potential? What's the function of that? I know it was a lot there. I apologize.
Well, I don't know that I'll be able to answer all of that. I'll just give you my summary of the model that I've been operating with. My hypothesis is that ancient cosmic war was terribly destructive. Basically, both sides, victor and vanquished, were shattered. Their infrastructure was basically in no condition to carry forward. So what they had to do was adopt a strategy of preservation of their knowledge by some means over time. So in my understanding of it, the mythologies that they constructed were constructed in such a way that they would only begin to reveal their true scientific content as mankind's science got back to the plateau that it was at when that cosmic war occurred. So my model has been that they had to jumpstart civilization rather quickly and preserve that knowledge. And that's not really a far-fetched hypothesis, because if you look at ancient Egypt, for example, or ancient Sumer for that matter, what has perplexed standard historiography is that these civilizations spring up almost overnight and almost whole cloth. In the case of the Sumerians and the Egyptians, you have an advanced mathematics, you have astronomy, you have domestication of animals, you have agriculture, you have organized economies, and so on and so forth. You've got all of the institutions that we take for granted as being part of civilization. But in the case of Egypt especially, they will tell you, if you look at their ancient texts, that they are actually a declined civilization. They're a legacy civilization of something that preceded them. So in other words, if there's any dot connecting to be done, I think what you have to do is bear in mind a tremendously destructive war and what the plan would be as that destruction becomes manifest. Well, you're going to want to preserve your knowledge. You're going to create priesthoods or secret societies or mystery religions, whatever you wish to call them, to try and preserve this knowledge and hand it down. And I think this is what happens. And interestingly enough, since you mentioned bankers, I'm glad you did, and the connection to physics, because if you look at the megalithic structures around the world, this was particularly the hypothesis of people like Alexander Thom, an Oxford engineering don, and so people like that. They looked at these megalithic structures and basically said that the standard academic narrative of units of measure in ancient times being based on human body parts or what have you was just utter nonsense. And that's true, because if you're going to try and jumpstart civilization again, well, what do you have to have? Well, you have to have commerce. And if you're going to have commerce, what do you have to have? Well, you have to have a system of weights and measures that are going to be easily deducible and applicable from region to region. So in other words, you have to have some system in place to have some common weights and measures in order to conduct commerce at anything more than a local level. And this is what you see them doing with some of these megalithic structures, because what they're doing is enshrining geodetic and astronomically based units of weights and measures. And those things, of course, are going to be true all over the surface of the planet. They're going to give you reliable measures, reliable weights, and so on. This is the first activity that we see happening circa 35,000 BC or so. So in other words, this activity again fits the overall model. Now, there is a connection, and this is kind of related to your other question about, pardon me, finance and physics, to basically state the point as simply as possible. Any financial system is based on some system of physics and energy. We have the petrodollar system right now. Well, it's based on essentially a closed system of physics with supposedly scarce, supposedly non-renewable resources. Now, I'm not a believer in the fossil fuel theory of fossil fuels, as a matter of fact. I'm not in that camp. But nonetheless, the basic system itself is still a closed system of energy. It's still a closed system of finance. If you roll things back to ancient Sumer, what you find is almost the exact opposite of what we now have with our petrodollars, our monetized debt. Because in ancient Sumer, you had a system of finance that was based on money representing the surplus of the state warehouse. In other words, it was debt-free money. It was not bullion based. It was not something that was based on scarce, non-renewable sources of energy or things like that. So you had an open system of finance because essentially you had a kind of open system of physics. And if you turn to the modern era, well, what do you see the Bilderberg group talking about, for the last 10 to 20 years? Well, one of the big things that has been constantly a subject of discussion is fusion power. Because if that ever comes online, of course, the whole economic system is in serious trouble because it's based on a very closed system of energy, and therefore it's a closed system of finance. So you see a lot of things going on right now that indicate that they're aware that a big paradigm shift is about to occur. I think cryptocurrencies are part of this phenomenon. And don't get me wrong, I'm not a big fan of cryptocurrencies for different reasons, but I do think that they might represent an attempt to bring out a financial system that is going to be an open financial system and not reflective of scarce non-renewable energy resources.
Yeah, I think as we move into the technocracy, I think that things like cryptocurrency and moving away from fiat currency is going to be more and more, pervasive and ubiquitous. Anonymous transactions are just going to be completely gone by the wayside. Going back to this hidden knowledge, etc., and how it kind of was coming out. Obviously, man, if we could all go back to the libraries of Alexander prior to the burning, that would be so awesome. As far as having a real insight of what's going on and what's our history, etc. And so, how do I phrase this? So this is kind of moving forward a little bit because obviously we're jumping kind of 100 years here, but the Venetians wound up sacking the Byzantine Empire and wound up getting access to ancient cartography, if you will, which really kind of defies what was modern cartography at the time. Maps of Antarctica without the ice, if you will. Move us forward a little bit into. I know I'm hitting you with so much here. The Medicis and their unraveling of the I forget what it's called, the Hermetic.
The Hermetic.
Yeah, the translations of the Hermetica, and how that began to take this occult-ish hidden technology, hidden understanding to the next kind of somewhat modern level in the Renaissance, if you will.
Well, let's those are two different issues. The Venetians sacking Constantinople, and then the Medicis in Florence with the Hermetica. So let's deal with Venice and cartography first.
Okay.
Because I think, and I lay out this case at some length in the Financial Vipers of Venice. In Venice's case, I happen to think that the Fourth Crusade was intentionally intended by the Venetians from the outset to go to Constantinople. And I think the reason they did so was that they were trying to gain access to the imperial archives there, some of which I firmly believe included manuscripts that were either saved from the Library of Alexandria or were copies of manuscripts that were in the library prior to its burning and so on.
That's because Byzantium, because that area was under Byzantium's auspices at that time, right? The empire was huge. Okay.
Egypt was part of the Byzantine Empire up until the 7th century, when at first it was taken by the Persians and then subsequently recaptured by the East Roman Empire and then subsequently captured by the Muslims. But for a prolonged period of time, it was part of the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire. Okay. So there's no doubt in my mind that the imperial archives would have had some cartographical information, because we see after the Fourth Crusade, we see the emergence in medieval Europe of maps, very accurate maps, as a matter of fact, of Europe that are called the medieval portolans, all right? And I strongly suspect, given Venice's probable involvement of an expedition to the New World with the Sinclairs in the 14th century and so on, I strongly suspect that Venice gained access to the New World, and particularly to the bullion supplies. This is a huge part of the story. Venice was essentially the bullion capital of Europe at the time. And they gained access to this hidden bullion supply, which allowed them to manipulate the bullion markets in Europe. And they did so very cunningly, very deceitfully. They basically ruined Florence for a period of time by their ability to manipulate the bullion prices, the gold to silver ratios.
Can I ask a quick question?
Sure.
Does that have anything? I know the Venetians were different than Christopher Columbus and Genoa and those guys who supposedly maybe came to the New World prior to his 1492, and that's he apparently had gotten relations with Indians and got gold from them. Is that completely separate? The gold, the bullion aspect, is that completely separate?
I don't know what you mean by separate, but
I mean, as far as the accumulation of gold, was the Venetians' accumulation of gold due in any way to some of those early trips to the New World, or was that their own accumulation?
No, I think the Venetians, you have to remember that Venice is in league with the Templars. The Templars are Venice's allies. And in fact, most people credit Venice with inventing double entry accounting. I really think that this was probably done by the Templars, and the Venetians simply inherited that bit of technology and technique from the Templars when the Templars were suppressed. Many of them went to Venice, became members of the Council of Ten, and so on and so forth. So I think that there's a connection there with the New World bullion via the Templars. And then, of course, you see the Venetians, the Zeno manuscript talking about the Venetians actually going to the New World with the Sinclairs, interestingly enough. So yeah, that connection's there. And what I'm trying to stress here by mentioning Venice and this hidden cartographical tradition is that this meant that Venice effectively was opening the financial system in Europe, but keeping it as a monopoly, as a state secret. So in other words, they had a hidden bullion supply that they could draw upon that no one else knew about. Now, this brings up Genoa, because Genoa, of course, is where Christopher Columbus hails from. Genoa is the other major rival to Venetian power in the northern Italian city-states. And lo and behold, what do we find out? Well, if you look at the capitularies, the contract between Ferdinand and Isabella and Columbus, Isabella makes the statement to Columbus, and I put this in the book, that, Columbus is describing all this wonderful stuff that, is out there that we can go get. And it's very clear that the context is not talking about Columbus wanting to take a voyage to the Spice Islands. Follow me?
Right.
It's very, very clear. And Isabella remarks, it's almost, sir, as if you've been there already. Well, lo and behold, the Turkish map of Antarctica that you referred to earlier in your question, the Piri Reis map from a Turkish admiral.
Yeah.
Well, Piri Reis, as a matter of fact, even states explicitly in the marginalia notes that he made on this map and in his own writings that Columbus had a secret map of the New World and had already made a voyage to the New World prior to his so-called voyage of discovery. So in other words, again, you have this not very well known tradition that Columbus himself may have taken a trip there and went back to Spain and sold Ferdinand and Isabella on backing a much larger expedition to stake out Spanish claims. And of course, Genoa is involved here. The Genoese are the hidden financiers of all this. Well, if you're Genoa and you learn that Venice has been doing this for some time, well, you want to go there too and find out what's there and get your hands on it. So the hidden players in this whole drama here are Genoa and Venice. So,
Pat, did you have a question? That's something you had wanted to say about the ancient maps?
Yeah, Doctor, are you familiar with Wayne Herschel?
The name is familiar to me, sir, but I can't place the context.
Okay, he has a website called The Hidden Records, and all of his studies and research were started by a dying Freemason who talked about all the ancient star maps of Orion and Pleiades, and how he claimed these three stars in that area were the origins of humans, is what he believed. And I wanted to ask your thoughts on Orion and Pleiades. And, you know, in Masonry and in a lot of other things in life, the significance of the number three, the three major and minor lights of Masonry, the three pillars, you know, this is something that's continual in Masonry. And what they represent is something bigger than necessarily what they say. Excuse me. But also throughout life, there's a lot of other things. Jesus was 33 years old. You know, there's all the Father, Son, the Holy Spirit. It's a nonstop thing. And I was just curious as to what your thoughts were on some of that.
Well, concerning the triadic structure of that you're getting at, I've actually done a lot of work on that in some of my books. I call it the topological metaphor of the medium, and it's dealing with the reason why you have these Trinitarian structures. You know, Christianity with the Trinity. You've got a Trinity in Hinduism. You know, Brahma, Vishnu, Krishna, and all of that. Yes. You've got a Trinity in the Mesoamerican texts, and so on and so forth. I think that this is coming out of a deep mathematical understanding of the nature of reality, and that's putting it as succinctly as I can put it. With respect to Orion and the Pleiades, there are all sorts of legends of various peoples around the world that seem to indicate, the Dogon tribe in Africa being a famous example, that have this mythology that they actually originate from a star system in Sirius. You know, so it's not surprising that it's there. Right. As to how it all links together or ties together, I don't know. I don't think anybody knows, because each of us researchers in this weird alternative realm is kind of out doing our own thing, and there's really been no one to come along and try and draw a synthesis together of all of it. That's been the big problem. Right. And more data, you know, keeps being discovered and added to the equation every day, it seems. So, you know, eventually I think what's going to happen is that synthesis is going to have to be done if the standard academic historiographies are going to be overturned. I think the case has been made that this alternative timeline does exist, but no one has done a synthesis yet to kind of tie all this data together, and that's been the problem. Yeah,
I find it very interesting. While a good friend of mine, a very, very intelligent man, Michael Chavella, who was my broadcast partner for quite a while, for about 7 years, he's back in Australia now. He's the guy that pointed this out to me, and he's written several books on some very interesting subjects. But I found it intriguing that all these star maps of Orion and Pleiades were basically all around the world in ancient civilizations near the, you know, they go back as far as you know, as far back as people can carve into rocks, basically. Very, very, very interesting stuff. And just the simple facts and things that, I mean, anybody has got to wonder why it is modern man can't figure out how they built the pyramids. You know, you've got to say to yourself, wait a minute, there's something seriously missing here in our intelligence levels.
Yeah, well, you know, people need to sit down and actually read Sir Flinders Petrie, the Pyramids and Monuments of Giza. He's the so-called founder of modern Egyptology, and he spends a great deal of time in that book talking about, and you can kind of tell he doesn't want to talk about it, but he talks about some of the structures, particularly the sarcophagus in the Great Pyramid, appearing to him as if it had been drilled out. You know? So
Oh.
the mind boggles because how they might have been able to drill things with fan belts and copper diorite balls and slurry, but to do so and get the kind of precision that they got would have been a different matter altogether. So yeah, you're right. There's all sorts of things indicating that these structures, some of these structures, are very, very old. They're too precise.
Right.
And the biggest problem I've had with the Great Pyramid, which I talked about in my pyramid books, is when they went to carbon date the mortar in the pyramid. They discovered that the carbon dating of the mortar at the top of the pyramid was about 1,000 years older than the mortar at the bottom of it. So, they built it from the top down.
Well, that kind of leads to your thoughts and your hypothesis that the Great Pyramid was some form of defensive or offensive weapon, and that was that changing of the mortar was due to a certain level of radioactivity at the base of the pyramid.
Right, exactly. Yeah, exactly. It's a conundrum that I don't think anybody has an answer to. I've read all sorts of explanations about how they built the thing, from the standard Egyptological things to more avant-garde notions, and yet none of them seem to be able to capture it.
No.
much less do so in a way that's going to get that building optically aligned like it is. So.
Right, and when you talk about the galactic wars and all this that blows most people's minds, and obviously it blows my mind, just to try to process, because we were taught our entire lives where humans came from, and so when we learn these ulterior these different possibilities, it's tough to grasp. It really is. But then you go back and you see the carvings and drawings, the ancient stuff of battles going on in the sky. And these are obviously back in times when people, at least from our knowledge, certainly didn't have anything that could fly.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, you get all sorts of very, very peculiar descriptions in these war tales of the gods. The Mahabharata in the Hindu tradition is full of descriptions of things that sound very much either like nuclear weapons or directed energy weapons of some sort. You've got the legends of Marduk or Zeus and their thunderbolts. You've got a very, very fascinating description of Marduk's weapons in the Enuma Elish. That are, if you look at them with kind of a modern physics eye, are quite eye-opening. So yeah, there's something going on back then. Clearly, that if you take the texts as they stand and at their word, are trying to describe a technology that they simply don't have adequate enough words for, but yet the descriptions are there, and you can kind of reverse engineer certain things, if you will, from the texts themselves.
Yeah, and then we talk about the civilizations, the ancient cities that have been dug up in the Middle East, and you may know the specific names and places. Obviously, I don't recall offhand right now, but where they had discovered cities underground that had excavated the entire city and found hundreds of skeletons in the streets, holding hands, dead, killed, and then the high radiation levels, massive radiation levels.
Yeah, you're talking about Mohenjo-Daro in India.
Yes, that's it. Yes.
The city there, you're quite correct. The skeletons, there are skeletons of people that look like they had been going about their everyday life, and then some cataclysm hit them. There is an extreme high amount of background radioactivity.
Wow.
Some Soviet scientists, as I recall, went there and did some studies there in the 1950s. I think it was the 1950s. And they concluded that some sort of nuclear weapon of on the scale of something like Hiroshima had been detonated. And again, that would fit the descriptions that you have in some of the texts of the Mahabharata and the Ramayana and some of the Hindu epics. So,
wow.
The data is there if you want to bother to look for it.
Well, that's the huge problem, Doctor. That's the huge problem with today. People
tell me about it.
Yeah, they have a very fast food way of approaching information.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, and not to digress, I guess, but I mean, I definitely wanted to try to synthesize as much of this as possible before we let you go. Going back to the Venetians and how they were so much of the economic powerhouse at the time, and some of their double dealings, and they were pretty shady in their double dealings. And talk about they were able to kind of maintain their power by working with both the Catholic Church and the Protestant Church at a certain point in time, moving north to expand their power, and then you wind up, like you said, going into, and correct me if I'm wrong, this leads into these multiple different families, which wind up going into certain countries, and they're all related, from the Russians to the Dutch to the English. Talk to me about that, the expansion of the Venetian power, if you will, during their
the Venetians established essentially an oligarchical state in the guise of a republic. And it's very interesting. Gasparo Cardinal Contarini.
Where have I heard that before?
He was a very famous Renaissance cardinal. He was actually the cardinal that was not only corresponding with Martin Luther, but also at the same time setting up the Council of Trent. So, he was definitely playing both sides against the middle. But he wrote an interesting treatise about the Venetian Republic, which incidentally our founding fathers read. There's some school of thought out there that had some influence on their thinking at the Philadelphia Constitutional Convention. But in any case, Venice, if you look carefully at what Venice began to do, the first thing that is a telltale clue was that the Venetian Republic began to liquidate its public debt right around the 15th and 16th centuries. And to me, that looks like a move that you would make if you want to get some liquidity and transfer headquarters, so to speak, because by that time it's very clear that this little city in a swamp at the northern end of the Adriatic Sea is not going to be able to be a global player with the discovery of the New World. So what you see happening, I think, is the transference of capital, and the same with Genoa, because Genoa, as I said earlier, begins to back Spain. Venice moves north, and you find a very interesting progression of banking families. The Fuggers family in Germany, the von Thurn und Taxis family in Germany, that's still a family that's around. It has an Italian branch. Della Torre Itasso is the Italian name of the family. So in other words, this family, this powerful banking family, exists on both sides of the Alps. What you see happening is very interesting, because another major banking center begins to arise at about this time in a swamp. And that's called Amsterdam, folks. And from there, if you study the history of the so-called Glorious Revolution, when Charles II dies, the English are again confronted with a problem of, how are we going to get a monarch? Well, they turn to the Dutch, and they bring over William Stadtholder, who becomes William III. And what's the first thing William III does? Well, he sets up the Bank of England and becomes a major shareholder. So you've got this transference of basically a Venetian way of doing things northward into Germany, and then subsequently over to Holland, and then, of course, across the Channel to Great Britain. And it's very interesting to me, you look at the costumery of the British monarchy, when they're out in all of their costumery for some state occasion. Well, it's very Venetian if you stop and look at it carefully. So I think it's very clear that you have this move of these Genoese and Venetian banking houses to transfer their headquarters, their base of operations, so to speak, but they keep the same methods. The methods, they have, the playbook hasn't changed very much in the last 500 years.
And we've definitely seen that.
Yeah, we've definitely seen that. You guys need to update things here.
Well, if it ain't broke, don't break it. You know what I mean? They seem to have a certain method. So moving forward, once again, like I said, trying to jam pack a lot in here, but you talked about a bit, and I'm not sure when exactly this took place. If this was more couple hundred years later, the schism that was kind of going on between that old European guard in the new world Anglican American aspect, if you will. Speak to that, the schism.
I'm not getting enough information there to understand what you're getting at.
From what I could understand from some of your videos, there after, I guess it was around maybe at the end of World War II, where where we kind of had our first conversation, that ilk went kind of underground. And even before that, I thought you had spoken something about there was kind of, I don't know, somewhat of a schism between the certain kind of powerhouses, if you will, in Europe, leading up to kind of somewhat today. If I'm off, I'm off. Then I apologize.
Well, I'm not latching on to what you're getting at. I do think to approach it from a slightly different angle. I do think that there was a fundamental conflict that was set up, namely World War I, largely by the British oligarchy, primarily using King Edward VII, Bertie, who kind of was the spearhead for creating the system of alliances to encircle Germany. England, by that point, knew that it on its own simply could not tackle Germany. It had to have some allies on the continent, but they also viewed Germany as the principal competitor that had to be taken out now. So there was a schism in a certain sense between the British oligarchy, the British royal house, and their German counterparts and Austrian counterparts. We know what the result of that was. But I think in contemporary times, the schism manifests itself, at least in this country, with what I've been calling factional infighting. You've basically got a mafia type of situation where the capos sit around at the same table, they drink their sherry or their brandy, smoke their cigars, kiss each other rings while they're shooting at each other out on the street. You have, I think, in this country, a factional warfare going on right now between various segments of the American deep state, and you find that same factional warfare going on right now in Europe. You've seen it with the Brexit vote in Great Britain.
Yes.
As a manifestation. The recent Italian elections. Let's remember that the Lega Nord in Italy, which is one of those Eurosceptic parties, is founded and has its strength precisely in Venetia, in the province that Venice is in. So in other words, all of these old fissures are surfacing again. You find the same thing going on in Germany, in Hungary. So there's some sort of deep factional infighting going on. And I do think that infighting is predicated upon one very simple phenomenon. They realize they're getting very close to their global-only goal, and now each faction wants to be the dominant faction that's going to run the show. And the closer they get to the goal, the more it falls apart, because they all want to be that faction, and they're all starting to fight each other. So
fascinating.
Yeah, to me, it's very clear.
Well, going back to what you said about how their playbook hasn't changed, do you see do you see that Venetian model still, being exercised today in any fashion? Do you see, any remnants of that in any specific, as you talked about in your videos, bloodlines, any specific bloodlines that,
Oh, yes. Those old, I even blogged about this recently, those old Italian noble families that are connected to Genoa, Florence, Venice, those families, Fontern and Taxis. And
right.
These families are still around. They're still very wealthy, and they're still very, very powerful. Forget about the Rothschilds. They're kind of Johnny-come-latelys to the game. The Italians,
and that's so funny, Doctor. Everyone throws that name out like they are the be-all, end-all. And I always say, if you know their names, like if they're so mainstream, then they're not the true players of. They're not the true architects of things. If you know their names.
No, I think you have to look at some of these old families. Very, very, the Giustiniani, another very, very old family in Italy that's still around.
Are you familiar with the Pallavicini? They're like an Italian. they're Muslims, but that name, I saw some videos that they go back to kind of the black nobility. You familiar with that name, the Pallavincinis?
The name is vaguely familiar to me. There's all sorts of
sure,
families, both in Italy and Germany. Again, those two countries in particular are key because, of course, northern Italy was part of the Holy Roman Empire. It was part of the Roman Empire at the time. So you have these interlocked families, and of course another very famous family would be the D'Este family, or sometimes it's called Estes. That's a very common family name.
And that's
Well, that family connects directly to the House of Orange in Holland, the Welf Estes. That family has connections to Queen Victoria. So, again,
links to the House of Hanover and Bavaria. Is that correct?
Oh, sure. Absolutely. They're all kind of interconnected.
It's so crazy. It's so wild.
It is crazy. I mean,
it is.
Stop and think of it. Kaiser Wilhelm, Queen Victoria's grandson, cousin to Tsar Nicholas, all of these very weird connections.
Well, and I suggest everyone to listen to our last interview, because our last interview, I kind of did it out of order. We kind of pick up at, beginning of World War II and the players involved. So if you don't mind, as it relates to what's going on today, when I contacted you before and I really wanted you to get on, I hear about, obviously Trump. Trump is now the white hat, the lone gunslinger going to save the planet. I don't necessarily buy that per se. Is there any relation to him to the Drumps, the DRUMPFs, but more modern and more contemporary? He was obviously a big real estate guy in New York, and obviously New York was run and is probably still run by the mafia. Are those Italian families in any way tied to any Italian nobility that he might still have some kind of alliance to?
Well, that I don't know. I can tell you that my suspicion when Mr. Trump made his announcement was that, yes, he was, from the outset, he was a deep state candidate, but from a very, very different faction than that which was backing Darth Hillary.
I love it. Yes, sir.
But my thinking in concluding that was that Mr. Trump has, heavy investments in casinos. And I've been in the casino business at certain times in my life. I know many people that still are, that were out in Vegas. And when Obamacare hit, the casino business in Vegas tanked, because what happened was the middle class lost their discretionary income. They weren't going to Vegas to go to the shows and gamble. And this began to cut into their bottom line. So I suspect that was one faction right off the bat that you could count in Trump's corner, that they were just tremendously upset at what had been done. I think there's other parts of the deep state that are definitely in his corner. So I don't view Mr. Trump as being a stupid man. I don't think he would have got into this game if he hadn't had some very, very powerful kind of behind the scenes backers.
I agree, and his allegiance or his family ties with Jared Kushner and that kind of New York kind of shady real estate alliance. Patrick, jump in here, man. Anything? We're going to let him go here in a little bit. Any closing comments, questions we have for the good doctor?
I've been spending most of the time learning and listening, but
I know.
I'm muted because I have a psychopathic 4-year-old in the house running around and yelling. So that's most of why I've been quiet. So no problems at all. You're asking the appropriate question.
They don't become psychopaths until they're teenagers.
And then they turn their parents into psychopaths. Well, what do you see, sir? I mean, before we let you slide, what do you see going on? In our future, we have divide and conquer on super steroids, and you're an individual, obviously, who understands the long game. I don't know if you want to take it to this level, but I saw a documentary not long ago about genocide and how it just doesn't happen overnight. It has to. There's a very slow, steady process of seeing your enemy no longer as a human. It has to do with propaganda, et cetera, et cetera. I see a lot of that going on in our society today. Marriages are breaking up. Families aren't speaking to each other. It's so viscerally polarized right now. And a lot of it has to do with these political footballs we're kicking around, when if we just step back and see the larger perspective of how it's by design. What do you see going on? I saw one of your interviews with dark journalists whom I love so much, and you guys called it hope porn. And I love that, because that's exactly what it is. to counteract the fear porn that's been going for so long, we actually have this notion that there's going to be accountability. These guys are going to go to jail, Hillary, etc. What are your thoughts on all of that?
Well, actually, the term hope porn was my friend Catherine Austin Fitz's term, and
Okay.
I just love it. So I've borrowed it from her. But to be frank, I hate to say I don't see a short or midterm prognosis that's good. I go back to a Princeton study that was done, I think 2 or 3 years ago, that concluded 2 very frightening things. Number one, that America is a de facto plutocracy and oligarchy,
Yes,
parading as a republic. And number 2, it's in a pre-revolutionary state. And nothing convinces me of that more than this j'accuse culture that we're in. We're, all we're lacking is Robespierre and the Committee for Public Safety and a few guillotines in the Place de la Concorde, and that's it.
J'accuse, ladies and gentlemen, en français, meaning I accuse, and that's exactly what we're seeing. Like the accusations are all you need to get fired, forced to resign, etc. Due process doesn't even happen anymore.
Right, it doesn't, and to me that's frightening thing number one. The bigger problem that I see is that there is a concerted effort, in my opinion, to destroy the 3 pillars of Western civilization, and in particular the Christian pillar. I tell my website people that I think that there's 3 essential pillars to this civilization. From Judaism, we get the idea of covenant or contract, the idea of a man's word is their bond. And of course, that implies rule of law. You can't have functioning economies. You can't have functioning contracts where there is no rule of law. The second pillar being the idea of incarnate logos, the incarnate reason, the harmony of the universe, and so on and so forth. That's a very, very powerful doctrine that I think lies right at the core of this civilization. And that doctrine, in turn, once you've comprehended its breadth and depth, invites its own critique. So the third pillar I've always viewed as that early Enlightenment sort of rational humanism that you see emerging in the 17th century. And that's the third pillar. And right now, what we're trying to have is a civilization built only on the third and not the other 2. It's like a one-legged stool, and that's not going to work very well for very long. And out of that Enlightenment philosophy, taken to its extremes, this is why we're entering the kind of pre-revolutionary culture that we're in. So my short to midterm prognosis culturally is not good. In the long term, I think this civilization is resilient enough that if it collapses here in the West, it will transplant itself somewhere else. There's already certain signs that it's beginning to do so in China, even in spite of the communist government there. Russia is totally misunderstood by the West. I've been saying for many years that Russia's the first postmodern state, and if we don't understand that, we're going to commit some very, very huge blunders and strategic errors, which we're already doing.
Well, yeah, over here, I mean, you're seeing it. It's 1970, it's 1980 again. Moscow is, it's the USSR, the evil boogeyman once again, which is just insane to me. I don't understand how it's able to. Well, I get it, but it just is hard to understand.
I have had, I have a Russian Orthodox background, and
oh wow,
I went online a few weeks ago, and I don't even remember what I was looking for, but I found this video on YouTube of an Orthodox liturgy being performed in the Cathedral of Christ the Savior in Moscow. And I looked at it and I said, Christ the Savior Cathedral, what? Because if you know the history of that church, it was actually a church that was across the Moscow River from the Kremlin, a big, huge church that Stalin blew up to build some Soviet palace to modern man or some such nonsense. And the Russians rebuilt the whole thing. They got out the blueprints and just absolutely rebuilt the whole thing in its original state. And I was absolutely dumbfounded. I was floored. And I discovered that the project was actually begun in the final 2 years of the Soviet Union. So,
Wow.
Whatever's going on over there, it ain't what we think it is.
Well, and that's the God's honest truth, man. The misinformation, the disinformation, Project Mockingbird, whatever you want to call it. I mean, it is sowing divisions that are deep, and we're gonna see we're not even halfway through it, man. That's why I think this is leading us and pushing us to something that we really don't want to see. But I always want to.
The sad reality is, I think we're already in a shooting war. This is becoming more and more apparent with each of these school massacres. This is a pattern that keeps repeating itself, and when you've got patterns like this, it's not coincidental. It's very, very deliberate. So I think we're in a shooting war already for whatever other reasons that you might attribute these sad events to. That's at least one of them.
Yeah, and Dr. and Jeffrey, you've heard me say this before. When you think of the word, most people think of the word apocalypse as, they think of it in terms of Armageddon, where actually it comes from the root word apocalypsis, from the Greek word, which means uncovering. And so I look at what we're going through now, with all these politicians and Hollywood people and everybody else, and thousands upon thousands of pedophiles being arrested, tons of uncoverings, a lot of stuff being exposed right now. Wikipedia exposing the corruption in government, just brutal corruption. I see this as the uncovering, the phase when everything gets exposed.
Mm-hmm.
We will see, and this adds to some of the hope porn, man. I swear. I mean, all of us sitting around waiting. Is Mueller working with Trump? Is Mueller after Trump? We're going to see it, man, in the coming days. Man, Dr. Ferrell, Dr. Farrell, I thank you so much for your time. I mean, I will continue. If you could throw out any of your social networking stuff, please, ladies and gentlemen, support his work, support his research, so the man can keep writing books. Where can we track you down, sir?
Best way is through my website, www.gizadeathstar.com. If you want to contact me, just use the contact button. That goes directly to my email.
Perfect. Pat, any closing statements for the good doctor?
No, I'm good. Thank you much for your time, Doctor.
Yeah, thanks for having me back on.
Doctor, thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, go track him down. This guy is the absolute truth. I cannot thank you enough for your time, sir. Peace and so much love and continued success. Stay tuned, ladies and gentlemen. There will be more. Thank you, Doctor.